Hey guys, it's Nate, and it's time for another bite size, right? So, these bite size episodes, they tend to be a little more freeform, a little short form, a little, I don't know, kind of up in the air and crazy. And I'm still actually like in the process of trying to kind of like pin down what I'm going to actually talk about. And I've got like three different things I've kind of been juggling around ever since Josh reminded me, asked me about the bite size this afternoon. And I said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that." And then I remembered that, and then I forgot about it again. And then you reminded me, or there might have been some more forgetting and remembering in the mix there. But I guess the idea that I'm going to sort of throw out there, and this is kind of like half baked and it's not fully formed. Hence, that's why it's a bite size and not a full show kind of topic. But it's this idea that I've been wrestling with. And so a while ago, I was listening to, it was probably, no, it was Quick Play, and he had someone on, and they were talking about films versus video games. And, and again, it's a, fully endorse and recommend all of Mark's content, even the stuff I'm not on and the stuff that I disagree with. Um, like love that dude, love that show. Go listen to that. But one of the more recent episodes, he had someone on and they were talking and they kind of got into this wrestling with this question as like video games as art. And they didn't really get into it. They sort of like they were talking about something else and it kind of skipped right over it a little bit. But it felt to me, and that's a question that I'm always sensitive to because I am an enthusiast and I'm one of those people who sort of does champion video games as art. Um, and it kind of put me on this kind of feedback loop, and not feedback loop, but like just a line of thinking and sort of like circling around some different ideas. And I was having different conversations with some of my friends in spaces, and it's kind of, I want to throw a few things out there, and this is actually kind of a response not to the quick play episode, but to an article I ended up reading because of the quick play episode. Because I just was like, I wanted to see like if there were any interesting articles about video games as art, which, to be fair, like is a terrible idea because the internet's always going to like fail you in the most significant ways. And a lot of what I found is like, video games can't be art, video games aren't art, or like these sort of like weak defenses of video games as art kind of stuff. But there was an article in particular that says video games are art, but they're bad art. And it's a paraphrase of the title. And if I had my phone on me, I could just tell you who wrote it. Um, but I ended up reading through it, and they kind of laid out like they had sort of a philosophical sort of framework, and they defined art in very sort of strict terms that, as I was thinking about it, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with their definition of art. Full disclosure, I don't agree with it, the premise of their article, either. And like I said, I could go get my phone, but that's not the point. And I'm not really critiquing I'm not going to like do a point by point like critique or breakdown of the article. I'm just saying like I read through the arguments. I didn't find them satisfactory. In fact, I thought they were kind of lazy and reductive, which I think is actually kind of my opinion on anybody who wants to dismiss video games as art. Now, that being said, what I do have to just sort of concede to is the fact that like most video games are not great art, and most video games probably aren't even art themselves. They might be artistic in nature. They might sort of, even demonstrate excellence in aesthetics and sound design and stuff like that. But when we're talking about the games as art stuff, and again, I don't think this like broadly applies to the genre. It's kind of like one of those things where, not like my sort of my fallback position is like when people are like video games aren't art because of X, Y, and Z. I'm like, well, if you're using that metric, not every book is art, not every movie or film is art, and not every music album is art, right? Like there's just kind of like they have this sort of almost like snobbish sort of highbrow expectation of art for it to and and I think that's part of the problem, is that defining art is hard. Like it's a conversation that I've had many times, and the I think the best definition that I can ever sort of like come up with when I talk about this is that art is someone's attempt to communicate a transcendent truth, or something transcendent, right? Because sometimes it's not true. Like, even sometimes there's good art that has like a bad message, or sometimes maybe that makes it bad art. But it's somebody trying to communicate something like something that they deem valuable through a particular medium. Now, and there's lots of reasons that, okay, like, you know, and again, like film, Roger Ebert was, famously decried video games as not being art, and again, it's just kind of like there's this thing where I think that it gets messy because there are things within these mediums of film and books and music, and even video games, that are art in and of themselves. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that I think falls within those mediums, right, that are just artistic in orientation, or they're not good art, and I so I think it's like you have to sort of draw a defining line and say, like, there's like good art, and there's like kind of bad art. But I don't even like saying that. I just think that there are things, when it comes to that particular question, like, it just gets messy. And so, like, again, the working definition that I have for it is just that, art is an attempt from someone to communicate something that they believe to be transcendent through that medium. So whether the medium's paint on like canvas, or whether it's, you know, um, a book, or whether it's a movie, or whether it's a song or an album, or whether it's a video game, it is someone's attempt to communicate something that they believe to be important, or like that is revelatory and reveals some sort of like greater truth about the human experience, right? And there's you have more or less success depending on the skill in which it's executed. And it does get like a little more complicated, especially with things like songs and music albums, because like usually that might be the artist and their tools, but there's also like a production. There's a producer, and there's probably some sort of recording. There's some sort of staff involved in sort of tweaking it and polishing it and doing the post production stuff. So while it is someone's, it's not just that, is a collaborative effort. And the same goes with, like, especially with movies. Like movies, it's like casts. Like we've all seen the credits. Like we've all watched like a Marvel movie, and we've waited for the credits to go by so that we can get like the post or the mid credits, extra scene, right? And there's sometimes thousands of names in these that just sort of scroll by you. Maybe thousands is an exaggeration, but it's, hundreds, dozens at the very least, of names, that sort of people who contributed with their skill. And so it's one of those things where, even sort of when you talk about that, like video games probably are more akin to that, because there are these very, like, there are teams of possibly hundreds of people who work on some of this stuff together, and it's a collaboration. Now, it's usually helmed by one person, the director, and their unique vision. I think like one of the biggest sort of auteurs in the space is Hideo Kojima. Most recently, Death Stranding 2 on the Beach has come out. I haven't played it yet. I was a big fan of Death Stranding 1. um, and the thing is, like, that there are those games in particular, like, you can see sort of like his fingerprints all over it. And like, and maybe Miyazaki from FromSoft. It's so funny. Like, I like both Miyazakis, but like, Studio Ghibli, or Ghibli, and FromSoft Miyazaki. That would be a weird mashup. But, that might be some, like, that might be, something along those lines. And so, like, there are there and like those guys in particular, and I even think about like The Last of Us, like, and sort of probably Druckmann is probably maybe the singular most important voice on The Last of Us series of games. Um, Ken Levine with BioShock, and well, BioShock Infinite, and now the Judas, and it's like they have a very particular vision. They're conveying very particular things, and they're executing them in very particular ways. And so I think that the more I've thought about this video games as art kind of idea and thing, is that the answer that I'm coming up with is it's not that video games are bad art, it's that we're not conditioned as consumers to engage with them as art. I think, like, the more I've thought about that, it's like, so it's almost that it's not that video games are bad art, it's that video games are art and you're bad at understanding it. Um, that's maybe a little accusatory or something. I don't know, but I think it's not it's one of those things, like, we've all, like, and it I think it complicates the situation and the dynamics of it. Like, video games are a more complicated medium to interact with and interpret and understand because they are interactive. It's not like watching a movie where you just sit and you sort of, like, you let you pay attention to the film, but you kind of just let it wash over. You're a passive observer. You're receiving this. Whereas with video games, there is this sort of, like, you are interacting with that simulated reality, right? Or the screen or whatever. And so I think that sometimes, because of and again, it's a young medium and there's a lot of stuff there, but I think that the pieces of the video game industry that are really probably that do deserve to be included in that conversation, it's harder to deal with those and talk with those because as consumers, we're sort of just conditioned to treat video games as mere entertainment. Whereas, like, I think mediums like movies and music especially have already sort of, like, that work is already a bit done culturally, and, like, you're able to sort of, like, sift through, like, what is really good and possibly profound and what is not. Whereas with video games, like, because of the youth of the sort of the the infancy of this medium, right? Is that it's it's just, anyways. Like, I'm kind of, like, getting down a rabbit hole, but it's like, I think that it's more of an issue that, one, some video games are just bad art, but I think that the video games that are artful, like, we're just not savvy enough. Like, as a general rule, the consumer populace isn't equipped to navigate that space. And so that it's maybe it's like, given time, given a little bit more time, like, we'll actually be able to, in hindsight, look at some of these things and be like, oh no, there's way more art here than, like, I think we wanted to give credit for, or whatever. And I think the other thing is that, um and of course, there's always, like, there's sort of, like, this knee-jerk reaction and defense to be like, sort of, like, want to almost, like, overemphasize the art of video games and just be like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of leading me into another, but it's like, I think the ways that we even think about art in video games is like, oh, through story and whatever, and it's like, I think most storytelling in video games is pretty, like, butt butts. It's, like, pretty bad. Um, and this is coming from a guy who loves, like, JRPGs and stuff like that. But, like, even some of my favorite JRPGs, I think the storytelling is, like, really heavy-handed and just not great. Um, which that's kind of like, and even in games I love and I would defend to like the death, I just think like there's kind of something. I recently finished my listen through of Infinite Jest, and oh boy, that is a book. Um, I'm actually going to try to start doing the actual physical read of it. And what's really interesting is when David Foster Wallace was writing that, he didn't write it in sort of A to B to C to, like, he didn't write it in a straight line, kind of like the plot sort of jumps all around the place. And there's actually, he describes writing it and sort of the shape of the book as there's just like, it's like a bunch of triangles sort of within triangles, kind of almost like making like a triforce kind of thing. Um, and he explained like the structure of the book as that, where it's like there's all these different sequences that are sort of happening and out of, and I think, I don't know, that story is like doing work on me. And like I said, uh, I I just finished it not too long ago, and it's really weird. Don't know how I feel about it. But I mean, it's David Foster Wallace was a genius, and there's no, like, just an insane talent. Anyways, all that being said, is that I think we tend to oversimplify. There's a couple things going on here. Like, one, I think as consumers, we are not properly equipped to deal with video games as art. Two, most video games aren't really high art. They're either pop art or just commercial, like commercial art. Um, and sometimes maybe they're not even art. They might be like artistic in orientation. Like they might have good design, they might have good sound, but they might not have anything important to say. And that's okay too. That's, I mean, like, we don't throw out like big dumb action movies because they're big dumb action movies. We just enjoy them for what they are. Um, so there's that. So it's like, one, consumers, like, we're just not equipped to, I think, navigate the games as art sort of headspace very well. And I think part of that is because we're expecting to be entertained, we're expecting like hooks. um and I think that's actually a really key part of the process too, is that, like, you might have something really interesting to say, but if you don't present it in a way that is mechanically satisfying, that's sort of a failure. So there's actually like a lot more complexity in sort of navigating that. um I think overall, like, we do oversimplify the sort of categories in which we think about games as art. So we want to look at it strictly through like maybe an aesthetic, like a visual aesthetics, like, and say like, oh, like the visual design of this thing is really great, right? But the thing is, you need to take it as a whole. So it needs, like, you need to be able to have discussions of not just about the visual aesthetics, but or the sound design or even the story, but how all those things sort of meet together. And then you can't, and again, you can't discount like the interactivity and the mechanics and the gameplay design. There's a lot there. um and so I do think that that's part of it. I think like the sort of like, yeah, and again, you can sort of say, no, it is a younger medium, and so like there's still a lot of like growing to do and a lot of like things to sort of like figure out and wrestle with. But I also, and I do think some of that is like, and some of this stuff is being explored in like indie spaces, which is kind of why I have a foot in indie spaces, and I sort of keep my eye out there, because I think sometimes you get some really interesting ideas. Now sometimes you get some absolute bunk. I mean, like, you just get some absolute like hot garbo. But um but yeah. Anyways, I guess like that's sort of where my head is at, and there's not like, there's a bunch of different sort of things going on there. But if we could distill it down, and I've already tried to do this a couple times, but one, gonna just restate, we as consumers are not just philosophically, psychologically prepared or equipped to really deal with video games as art as a general rule. I think that's one of the biggest problems. Two, um, we over like we I just had my two, and then I kind of lost it. But anyways, like, I think again, part of the problem is that we oversimplify like the categories by which we want to sort of say, this is art, this is art, this is art. And it's like, no, you have to sort of evaluate the thing as a whole, and you might have artistic components. I think the other part of that is that just, yeah. Anyways, I'm kind of just like, I'm this is just some ideas about the conversation of games as art. I think the big takeaway is that it's just, I think it's more about us and how we approach the games versus the games not having anything important to say, or the games not being art. And I also think it's like there's a lot of stuff like that sometimes we don't play because it's not within our preferences. So like I don't play a lot of side scrollers. So in fact, I'm kind of coming to terms with the fact that I think side scrollers are kind of dumb. And I know that's like a wild thing and crazy thing for a guy who co-hosts a video. I just think side scrollers, I think platformers as a general rule are kind of like, it's weird to me. Like it's a pretty boring genre in my opinion. Even the really good ones, it's kind of like I appreciate them and I might enjoy them, but as a general rule, like if there isn't a little bit more to the game, like to hook me, and that's probably a personal thing, like puzzle games and sort of like, I'm currently, as of, I'm supposed to record an episode tomorrow about Mist, and I still haven't beaten the game. Don't worry, Paul, I'm going to try to. It's not long and I'm using a walkthrough, which somebody's like, that is the worst possible way to play a game, and I'm like, I don't care. But all that being said, right, is that it's kind of a messy thing, and I think that there's a lot of room to actually like have there's a lot of conversations that need to be had about all of it. But most importantly, I think it's more about how we choose to interact with it. And I think that like sometimes there are games that, again, that aren't maybe in our wheelhouse, but that I think probably do belong in that conversation. Like I rattled off some of the ones that I think belong in that conversation as art. And those are all like bigger, sort of like more like AAA kind of things. And I'm sure if you gave me enough time, I could probably think of like some more indie, smaller budget kind of stuff that I think is like, well, I know I was talking about platform and I got sort of, but I was like, Braid is in that conversation. People are like, games as art. Braid is like one of those games as art conversations. I've never beaten Braid. I have actually really no interest in beating Braid. Like I like the game. I like the idea of that game as sort of an interesting piece. I think Jonathan Blow, I'm pretty sure he's the guy who made Braid. I'm kind of like, again, I'm like kind of half fried. It's the end of the night. Had a really rough couple of days, and I'm kind of like just winging this. But like, I don't care about platformers or 2D side scrolling platformers, especially. And so it's like, in some ways, that's a little bit of an inaccessible piece of art for me. That doesn't diminish what that game has to say or the merit of it. That just means that I can't interact with it. And I think that sometimes it's stuff like that that prevents us from really being able, like, so all that being said, here's the thing is video games are art. Some of it is not great, but the pieces that are, sometimes the reason that we don't get it is because we're bad at it. We're just bad at understanding that and sort of interacting with it, because like it is art that requires you to interface with it in a unique way. And because there is that sort of like that skill thing, right? And it's not just super accessible, right? It's not like a painting. It's not like Starry Skies by Van Gogh or Gattaca by I think it's Gattaca by Picasso or whatever. It's not some painting that you can just sort of sit and take in. It's not just some sort of album that you can sit and take in. It's not a song. It's not a movie. It's like you actually have to interact with it. And because of that, that makes it more complicated. And I think maybe in some ways the payout might actually be higher because you're actually having to interface with it. Maybe. I'm not 100% there. But this is a bite size, and these are some like weird, sort of like random, kind of crazy thoughts. And I've been going on about this for entirely too long as it is. So that being said, if you guys think there's anything worth sort of dialoguing about this with me, feel free to reach out to me. The contacts and all that stuff that's in the show notes. I'm in our Discord. Yeah, whatever. The things. But until next time, guys, I'm Nate. This has been a bite sized. Do the things, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.